So you think it's been good so far? You ain't seen nothing yet. Tonight's panel is going to be just really great. It is my total pleasure to introduce the former Lieutenant Governor of Colorado, Barbara O'Brien, and one of the nation's top children's advocates and experts, who's going to issue a little bit of a challenge to the panel tonight. Barbara O'Brien.
Good evening. Wow, Michael, this is incredible. Thank you. And I must say, I put a son through undergraduate school here, and to come back when you're not sending tuition payments in is like a really good feeling. I think we're all here because we know that we need a game changer in the way we educate all of our children, and that whatever we're doing now isn't quite working for all of them. Some are doing fine, but vast numbers of kids, especially lower income kids, are withering on the vine. And when you work in early childhood education, as I have for a good part of my career, and you see 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, they are learning machines. You cannot stop them from learning. And then you look at a middle school student, and I know hormones and all of that, but basically you can't force them to learn. And yet they will, and I say this because my own sons, they'll read series of science fantasy books. You know, they'll all read Harry Potter when the vocabulary is way above their level. And I think somehow we've lost the magic in education. And I know what our panel is going to help us with tonight is how to rediscover the power and the magic of curiosity and learning and being open to understanding that we're part of a bigger world. I also know that there's just hardcore educational stuff we have to figure out. Basically, if kids aren't reading at 3rd grade level by the end of 3rd grade, essentially they never catch up. So it is really important that we figure out how to harness entertainment and media to help kids keep that love of learning that they have when they're tiny, and be part of learning. So it's not a matter of an education system trying to make them learn and catch up. They are voracious about consuming information and reading skills and connectedness to other people and issues. And I truly believe, as an old English major myself, that the power of narrative and the power of stories is the kind of thing that can ignite a child's imagination and their mind and help them leapfrog over wherever their skills are, because they want some information, they want an experience of the imagination, an aesthetic experience, and they'll do almost anything to get there. And I think you all are going to be part of the solution of putting the magic and the power back into learning for all of our kids. So it's my great pleasure to pass the baton and have you introduce, Betty, the panel and hear what we have to learn tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome to tonight. Some of us had wine at dinner, some of us had coffee. And the challenge for you is to figure out who did what. Anyway, I thought I'd start out by sharing with you something. I had recently had to prepare something about storytelling, and I found, this is a true fact, that anthropologists have determined that a full 60%, or almost 2/3, of what human beings learn and retain, they learn in the context of storytelling. And at first that surprised me, but it probably shouldn't be that surprising if you think about how pre-writing, pre-printing press, pre-everything, most of our cultural and learning and cultural things have been passed down through the telling of stories. And so it seems somehow fitting tonight that we have a panel of world-class storytellers who are going to have some interesting things to say about this. And we just heard from Barbara and from a lot of the panelists today that Obviously, there are some real challenges in education right now that are preventing us from, that could prevent us from having the future we want for our kids. And the current approach to engaging kids seems to be missing certain things. And so it's our panel's duty tonight to have all of the educators and everybody in the audience tonight try and give some thought to, well, what is it that might be lacking? And so we're going to consider the underutilized but potentially essential thing called the power of storytelling in helping kids learn and grow. And that's what we're going to set out to do. All of our bios are in your book, but these people up here have done such amazing things that there's a little bit of repeating. To my left, first of all, is everyone's well-known, one of the 50 greatest women in television. Now she's experiencing pain. Marcy Carsey is she put together one of the most successful independent TV production companies known to man, and her company was responsible for The Cosby Show, Roseanne, Third Rock from the Sun, Grace Under Fire, The 70s Show, all sorts of things that you all know and love. And she also serves on the advisory board for Common Sense Media, so she has an interest in this space. So please welcome Marcy Carsey. Next to Marcy is Don Hahn. And you might not, I don't know if you all know his name, but you will certainly know what he's done. He's produced the classic Beauty and the Beast, which I might add, as an animation historian, the first animated feature ever to be nominated for an Oscar. His next film, a little thing called The Lion King, broke all box office records and continues on Broadway to this day. But don't think of him just as the animation producer guy. He also did Disney's Earth, the documentary series, and an animated short, The Little Match Girl, which also earned him another Oscar nomination. So another major storyteller among us. Thank you, Don, for being here tonight. And to my far left, last but definitely not least, is Douglas Wick, another amazing producer. He produced The Gladiator, which won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. He did the first Stuart Little and then teamed with his wife Lucy Fisher to produce Stuart Little 2. And he and his wife have gone on to produce a wide range of motion pictures. The one that might come to mind for all of you most recently might be Memoirs of a Geisha, but he's in the middle of producing Great Gatsby as we speak. A media literacy project, if ever there was. So I thought we'd start out by having each of them, and some of them, all of you brought clips, right, to show some of this. But we asked them to think about, for starters, and then we're going to come around with some follow-up questions, and then I'm going to ultimately make sure there's time for interaction with the audience, because I think the real issue here is a better sense of partnership between media and the education world. And so I asked all of them to think about, given the remarkable influence you've had on audiences pretty much worldwide, and certainly family audiences and parents and kids, what do you feel are the most critical factors in telling and creating a compelling story? In some cases, you're producers, so you're identifying what makes a great story that you'd want to tell in a new way, like The Great Gatsby. So, what are some of the most important elements of a great story, and how is it, if it has evolved over time, what makes for a great story? And to what degree do you have you worked with educators or after school or museums to have your work out there, and to what degree are you happy or unhappy with what's happened so far? So that's the first question that I asked them to think about, along with a corollary question. You know what? I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to stop right there, and then I'm going to come back around with a second and a third question, and ultimately you will get to ask them your questions. Marcy, why don't you start?
Okay. I was gonna, they said bring a 2-minute clip or something, and I mean, I'm such a dinosaur. Everything I've done is ancient history anyway by now, because, people, grandmothers come up and say, oh my God, I grew up with your stuff. And so I was going to bring the clip from the pilot of that 70s show where, the kids were all smoking pot, but I thought, you know what, this is about kids. So, okay. So I brought a clip from I think it's from the Cosby pilot. So can I just say, run it, and they'll run it?
I'm supposed to do something now. Where?
Dad.
Hey! All right.
Dad, I thought about what you said, and I see your point.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I have a point too.
Make your point.
You're a doctor and Mom's a lawyer, and you're both successful in everything, and that's great. But maybe I was born to be a regular person and have a regular life. If you weren't a doctor, I wouldn't love you less because you're my dad. And so, instead of acting disappointed because I'm not like you, maybe you can just accept who I am and love me anyway because I'm your son.
Theo, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. No wonder you get D's and everything. Now you are afraid to try because you're afraid that your brain is going to explode and it's going to ooze out of your ear. Now I'm telling you, you are going to try as hard as you can. And you're going to do it because I said so. I am your father. I brought you in this world, and I'll take you out. Now, son, come here. Come here. Now, listen to me. I just want you to do the best you can. That's all.
I'll try, Dad.
Yeah.
I really will.
All right. I love you.
Yeah, Dad.
Huh?
I know.
Yeah. And maybe your mother loves you too.
Before this was 1984, but before this, for several years, the kids had been in charge of households and in family comedies and family dramas. The kids would have a statement like he made, "Can't you just love me and accept me for who I am?" And you heard the audience applaud, because that's what sitcoms said. The kids knew best. The moment we knew this show was a hit was when Bill turned it around, just said, "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard." And it was the parents taking back the household, and the audience loved it. But so that was about that, but that was ancient history. So Betty, to Betty's question, what makes good storytelling? And I think this is universal. I'm not an educator and I'm not tech savvy. I'm just a sitcom producer, but I do know what makes good storytelling. And I think it whether it's movies or plays or bedtime stories, the very, very basic thing is respect for the audience. It's the first and most important thing is, you can't do something that's been done before because it worked then, you can't pander, you can't whatever. You really need to respect the audience, to be the audience. You are the audience. It's not, that's them and I'm me. You are part of the audience, and as much as you respect yourself, you have to respect your audience. That plus the truth of the characters. If you're doing a show about a family, it better damn well be a family that behaves like a family. If it's about a kid, it better damn well be a kid that behaves like real kids. A working housewife, blue collar. It better damn well be representative of the true nature of a real, solid, blue collar person. I was raised blue collar. I know what these people are. And they're just as smart as anybody else who had better advantages at birth, just as great, just as awful, just as varied, just as whatever. That just happens to be accident of birth. So you have to be, true to the reality of the situation, and then you have to just entertain the hell out of them. Make them laugh, make them cry, whatever your intention is, but you got to do that well. So that's, I think, the essence of all storytelling.
any experiences where you thought, why couldn't that have been used in schools, or you're actually aware of it being used?
I can't imagine that it wouldn't be used in schools. I mean, I'm an independent, so we own the copyright, so there's no issue. I don't know what anybody would have an issue. Why would a studio have an issue with a school using it? I don't know, maybe they do, but I mean, I would gladly just disseminate, you know, these DVDs or whatever the school wanted, and let teacher by teacher, let them do whatever they want. I mean, why not?
Well, we're going to come back to that in the Q&A, because we're hoping to get some people to step up and tell us what they need or what we need from them, and that's going to be part of the Q&A. So make note of what you just said, and we're going to move on to Don. And back to the question of what you think makes for great storytelling, and that might be relevant to teaching and educating, and how have some of the things that you've created either had the opportunity or not to be useful in learning and growth for kids?
I don't know. I approach it from a number of different ways. One, and I completely agree with what Marcy's saying, it's the personal involvement. We always talk about movies as the willful suspension of disbelief, and the ability to go into a theater and turn the lights out and forget about your gas bill and your kid's tuition and completely get immersed in what you're seeing on the screen. I also think as filmmakers we have about 30,000 years of recent human history to draw on in terms of our mythology to pull in. And I brought along a couple of clips that I hope speak to that. When we were doing Lion King, we were doing a, quote, original story, because it wasn't based on any sort of literature or currently existing material. But it's really not original at all. I really feel like good artists borrow, great artists steal. And I feel like that idea that we are original is perhaps arrogant. So when we were doing Lion King, we based it deeply on the mythology of the Moses story, the Joseph story, a kid who grows up in royalty and screws up and is exiled and has to grow up in poverty, as in the Moses story, and come back and win back his kingdom. That's Lion King. Hamlet is heavily wedged into the Lion King story. And when we were first working on it, I had trouble getting people to work on it, because the pitch went something like this. I would say, it's going to be great. It's Moses meets Joseph and Hamlet in Africa with music by Elton John. People went running out the door and wanted to have nothing to do with it. But my point is, it drew heavily on our social hardwiring and our collective mental real estate. We all have images of Africa in our head. We all have images of those stories in our head. And we stole heavily from those. The first clip I brought along is the opening of the movie, and it's just a short clip. The other thing we stole from is the Alex Haley miniseries Roots, where a baby Kunta Kinte is lifted aloft by his father, which is how we dealt with Simba's christening at the beginning of the movie. Literally, and I hope there's no IP lawyers here from Disney, literally taken from that moment, because it's so mythic. And here's how, this is a really odd clip, this is how President Obama used it in his White House Correspondents' Dinner last couple weeks ago. So let's take a look.
As some of you heard, the state of Hawaii released my official long-form birth certificate. That's correct. But just in case there are any lingering questions, tonight I'm prepared to go a step further. Tonight, for the first time, I am releasing my official birth video. I warn you, no one has seen this footage in 50 years. Not even me. But let's take a look.
point is, yes, Lion King is well known, but even more well known is Moses and Joseph and Hamlet and that moment from Roots. And I think people respond to that because it's in our brains, it's in our collective understanding of culture. The next clip I brought along is the kind of logical progression of Lion King. This is from Julie Taymor's adaptation of the story on Broadway. And the reason I brought this along is, as quite often we think about literacy as reading, and rightly so, we should. But I also feel like visual literacy is equally, if not more so, important. And Julie is fearless when it comes to visually trusting the audience, to go back to something that Marcy was saying. Trusting the sophistication and the ability of the audience to take in something even if they don't completely understand it. And in this clip, notice how she really relies on the audience's willful suspension of disbelief. So you can put grass on the head of a dancer and suddenly it's the savannah. And a puppet can show up that's this big, that looks like something like a Bunraku puppet or something, and you totally believe that that's the character. All the characters have headdresses on, so you have a double read of the actor's face and the character's face above it. And it was highly debated when we were working out the Broadway show with Michael Eisner and all the people around. It's like, can the audience take all this in? Is it too much information? What face will they look at? It doesn't matter. The audience is way ahead of us in terms of their ability to take in all that information at the same time. So here's a little clip of kind of a recap of some of those images from Lion King, and just thinking about the visual storytelling that's going on here and the layers of storytelling being told through words and dance and sculpture and puppetry. Here we go. The audience's level to take in so much material and assimilate that at their own level. And we don't, as entertainers and storytellers, we don't have to decide what level that is. We can tell that story at whatever level we want to. And if you're a 3-year-old or an 80-year-old, you'll come to that story with your own heart and you'll understand it on your own level.
Thank God I don't follow that. And have you found that are people showing the Lion King? Are they in a position to show the Lion King in classrooms? The stories and the mythology that of all of your work, are you aware of it? Have you tried?
I'm not aware of it. It's the other thing we borrowed from heavily is the Joseph Campbell mythology, that kind of idea of a monomyth that we all ascribe to, and that hero's journey kind of idea. I think it's really relevant. I'm not sure. We face all the same problems, I think, that every studio faces, and I'm sure we'll get into this more in the next hour, but the idea of Does the classroom feel like we're selling? Does this clip we just showed feel like you're selling, or is it actually interesting content for discussion? Do we have to overproduce things? I feel like we probably overproduce far too much. I think the student or the local teacher can take materials on their own level and produce things that are really interesting and relevant to them, and we as a studio don't have to spend $10 million on each title to overproduce educational media. So I'm not an educator. I don't have experience in that area, but so I don't really know how much it's being used on a daily basis, or any of the Disney properties for that matter.
We'll find out. Doug.
I'd like to thank anyone in advance who's doing educational work. I have 3 children. I very much appreciate it. My company is named Red Wagon Entertainment. And the name comes from when I was a kid. I used to take my cousins in a wagon, and they'd give me a few quarters, and I'd drive them around, get a rose garden, through the rose garden, through bushes. So it seemed like that was more or less the experience I'd like to give the audience. You'd put them in the wagon, you'd take them somewhere, and hopefully get a few bucks. For you educators, and I separate myself from my distinguished colleagues, I'm what's normally referred to as Hollywood trash. And only in the sense that I've spent most of my adult career chasing stories. Thousands of hours of searching stories, perusing old stories, making up stories, hearing other people make up stories, wasting of hundreds of trees for stories that might not happen. And one segue on this, because really is just an endless story conversation in my world and in theirs. One of my favorite things that came out in the Anthony Pellicano case was he had illegally wiretapped a friend of mine, a very good producer named Chuck Roven. And he had been wiretapped by the director, John McTiernan, who was looking to get him. So Pellicano also wiretapped illegally his conversations with his client, John McTiernan. And in those transcripts, Pellicano says, "You don't pay me enough money. I've had to listen for Chuck Roven for hour after hour talking about story arc, and it's killing me." So that was another point of view on my world. So where do we find ideas for movies? As my colleagues have alluded to, books, Greek gods, newspaper articles, commercials, amusement park rides, TV shows. I got the idea for Working Girl from seeing a young woman on the street. It was a very long time ago who was dressed very fancy from the ankles up. And in those days, if you were wearing tennis shoes, it meant you were a commuter before they were in fashion. So there was a whole thing, if she could pass anywhere from the ankles up, but the shoes gave her away, what would be that story? And so I've always been really curious about the power of an idea, how long they last, how they have different incarnations, different times because of technology and other things. So here was one movie I made, and I've always loved that this is where the idea came from. I'm going to quote E.B. White. In the late 1920s, I took a train to Virginia, got out, and walked up and down in the Shenandoah Valley in the beautiful springtime, then returned to New York by rail. While sleeping in an upper berth, I dreamed of a small character who had the features of a mouse, was nicely dressed, courageous, and questioning. When I woke up, being a journalist and thankful for small favors, I made a few notes about this mouse child, the only fictional character ever to have been honored and disturb my sleep. So the idea in the late 20s that he could have a character, an idea that would be so strong, it was rejected by a lot of publishers. It was finally published in the 1940s to good response. But it never really had a life as a movie. And one of the reasons was the technology didn't exist to do it well. So in the later 90s, it was finally possible to have a computer graphic protagonist. So E.B. White, his Stuart Little, could suddenly be born of this new technology, which didn't exist 5 minutes before to do it. Now, any time you talk about technology, it's always neck and neck with artistry. And of course, for any who've ever seen the movie, you know that the soul of the character is Michael J. Fox's beautiful voice, where you can hear all his pathos, his hunger, his sweetness. So I finally went to my kid's 4th grade class to talk about this movie I was making this several years ago. And you know those moments when you're, well, for those of you who are teachers, when you're teaching and you're having a really self-satisfied moment. And I was really feeling great. I just was talking about the power of the idea and also talking about how Stuart Little deals with a world from that size and how it's empowering. And I thought this would be really good. And remember, this is LA, and honestly, one kid raised his hand, and I said, yes. And he said, what do you think it will do opening weekend? So it just really gave me great respect for anyone in the teaching profession. But all ideas don't make good movies. Just thinking about what a bad idea for a movie is, just last night, I Googled biggest flops in movie history. And the first one that came up was Cutthroat Island, 1995, $10 million revenue, total cost $115 million. And if you just read that, you'd say, okay, you conclude that pirate movies were irrelevant to the audience, bad idea, and you would have lost billions of dollars. In terms of how my own feelings about stories were cultivated, the most important book I ever read, for those of you who might know it, was Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment. And it describes the meaning and importance of fairy tales, and in doing so, brilliantly articulates why some stories work, why they're impactful, why some stay relevant for hundreds of years, and others blow away like an old paper. And he talks about stories that allow us and the child to become familiar with the content of our unconscious through spinning out daydreams, ruminating, rearranging, and fantasizing about story elements in response to unconscious pressures. He talks about the impotence of stories that fail to reflect our turbulent inner lives, our primitive drives, and violent emotions. Bettelheim says that Freud's prescription is that only by struggling courageously against what seems like overwhelming odds can man succeed in wringing meaning out of his existence. That sounds like a movie. That sounds like most of my favorite movies, whether it be The Wizard of Oz or Lawrence of Arabia. Or as the writer Jim Harrison said, a myth is news that's still news. The Bettelheim analysis helps explain to me why some stories have power and others don't. It's not a paint-by-numbers formula, but it made me very mindful of how different stories speak to the fears and aspirations of our inner life. I'm going to show 3 clips from movies I worked on, and each clip is 2 parts. One is, pretty short by the way, one is a kind of predicament for the protagonist. And then the other, later in the movie, is a short piece of resolution. And they were story strands that were really, had a lot to do with why I want to make these movies. So just because it'll come kind of fast, you're going to see one sort of character problem and then a moment of character resolution on 3 different movies in a row.
Someone like me. You shouldn't worry about choosing. It happens the same way every time. First, you won't know what to do, you'll be a little bit scared. Then you'll meet one of them. You talk to them. Somehow, you just know. That's why I've been feeling so sad. That's why I keep thinking of them. I'm not a stout, I'm a little. I'm Stuart Little. I'm Stuart Little!
name is well-deserved, Spaniard. I don't think there's ever been a gladiator to match you. As for this young man, he insists you are Hector reborn. What's it Hercules? Why doesn't the hero reveal himself and tell us all your real name? You do have a name.
My name is Gladiator.
How dare you show your back to me? Slave! You will remove your helmet and tell me your name.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true emperor, Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next.
Hollywood, with its capital and infrastructure, has lured the best storytellers in the world to its community of filmmaking. These brief clips and the other work you saw show an extraordinary level of craft, artistry, and showmanship. In this case, not great editing. And the people with all that storytelling expertise live over there somewhere. And though they get divorced too much, go to rehab too often, there has to be some way they can be a better resource for your great mission.
I wanted to ask, since we've now heard how you tell stories and how much has gone into all of your work, we're now in this kind of moment, technological moment, where probably some of the people who will be in the arcade tomorrow will be demonstrating technology that enables even a third grader to produce their own stories, to create their own animations, to edit on their computers. And I was wondering, as master storytellers, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of storytelling in the hands of people at earlier ages? And do you feel that a lot can be learned in the making of stories, no matter how old you are?
Oh, I think it's incredibly helpful. I mean, I know in a whole different era, when I was fooling around with Super 8 camera, and you sort of realize things like, my favorite early one was that you could have someone jump out of a one-floor window, and then you could cut to a body falling from a building, and it looked like, for a little boy, that looked so cool. It looked like someone had jumped, and then you cut to the body hitting the ground. So I think storytelling is a very natural instinct, and I think the chances of those tools not just going to people who are privileged or have families who are in the business and people who have a natural inclination, drawing them out is a really hopeful thing.
Yeah, I would feel the same way. I think it's a huge time for accessibility to tools that can tell stories. It's important to remember that stories are a human activity. The computer really doesn't do anything. Certainly Ed Catmull, who's the president of Pixar, he really feels like the artistry and the technology have to work hand in hand to create something interesting, at least for filmmaking the way they do it. I can set up a kid with a stop motion a puppet like a Barbie doll and a camera and a computer in an afternoon in a couple of hours, and they can make a film. Or we can supply somebody with a video camera to go out and make and edit and score your own film on your laptop or on your iPad. And I think those kinds of tools, as generationally we all get better with them and grow up with them, like my daughter's 19 now, but she grew up with those tools. It's second nature to her, and she's going to art school in Chicago, and her filmmaking teacher sends her home on the weekends with a project to do a film the way I would get sent home with a paper on George Washington or something. And she's okay with that. She can go out and shoot it, she can put it together, and she can turn it in the next morning, and it's transparent to her. So, recognizing that we need those tools to tell our stories, I think it's time for amazing optimism in terms of storytelling.
I do too. Going both ways. I mean, both the ability of kids to tell stories is enhanced by the technology, but also to receive stories is enhanced by the technology. I mean, you know, I read to my kids every night. Most of us did. I'm sure they'll read to their kids. Betty, you and I are talking about the fact that if the technology existed when my mom was reading me Little Women chapter by chapter every night, and it was my favorite time of day, if that were recorded somehow, if that were, you know, on a tape or a thing or whatever, or digitized somehow, so that my daughter could hear my mother read those stories and her grandchildren could hear my mother read those stories, that's, I think, also, you know, what is remarkable. And that's just a simple little example of, you know, access to all kinds of storytelling, personal stories, all kinds, as well as kids being able to create, because all kids create stories. We know this. I mean, my son went to a Montessori, and he was writing stories before he could write. You know, with the help of his wonderful teacher. You know, he was, you know, telling, writing, the letters, the scribbles were almost writing, you know, and then he'd illustrate it and stuff. And within 6 months, he was sounding out the words and the thing and making the pictures, and it was fabulous. And he was, you know, wasn't even 3 yet, but he was telling stories.
Innately, yes. So far we've heard a bit about what you guys think is a great story. I heard a lot about respect for the audience, which I think has probably relevance to teaching. We've talked a little about the technology, and I know we're getting close to the end, and I want to open this up to the audience, and I want to lay out, just from my own experience working for a major media company and some of the conversations we've had on the phone, there have been some sort of barriers between schools really being able to use the Hollywood storytelling and Hollywood storytellers. It's not always that easy to sort of say, I'd like to have my stuff being used by educators and on your own, or even in your companies, and make it happen. And I've always picked up on, there have been like 3 sort of negative statements or challenges. And I'm wondering, and I'll tell you what I think some of the challenges are. And would want to hear from both people in the audience at this point and from our panel if you even think they are still challenges, if all of us are overestimating this, and sort of who should be in the middle to sort of make some of this more relevant. One thing that the media companies will tend to say is, well, we don't have the patience and the time to deal with this whole textbook adoption thing, and getting our stuff into schools is really the purview of textbook companies, and that's not our business, and there's not enough money to be made, so why should we bother? Schools and sometimes parents and educators, Don mentioned this, you know, there's sometimes a sensitivity that if they use our stuff as is, it's a marketing ploy, it's just Disney or some, you know, whoever, trying to just use schools as marketing agents, which nobody wants to be. And then there are also educators who say, I would love to use this stuff, but I don't know legally what my rights are. I don't know if it costs a lot of money to license your stuff. We know we don't have the resources to like deal with legions of lawyers that media companies have. And you run into
that's the biggest thing, because 15 years ago Disney sued a preschool for painting Mickey Mouse on its walls. That creates an environment of hostility that I'm not sure we're over yet, because it's true, absolutely true story, and it is amazing, and you feel like, well, great, so I want to use Donald Duck in my lesson today. Am I going to be descended upon by lawyers? And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a huge hurdle.
Well, now also I think that the only way to get this to let's say you could get past all the licensing issues, and then there's the question of, you know, is it shameless marketing or not? And I feel that one of the things that needs to happen more is that there are really good people out there, I think, who can translate our stuff into, and here's the question, like, I'm not even sure Marcy would want her things translated into a learning goal-oriented lesson plan, or if it should be used as is. So I'm curious to hear from the audience. First of all, do you guys think we're overstating or overestimating these obstacles? Do you think that the deployment of technology and the way schools are changing is going to make a lot of this moot? Or what would we all need to do to be able to collaborate more effectively with each other? And I see a hand up in the back. Do we have microphones running out? Okay.
Thank you.
It would also be great if you could say what side of all this you come from. What do you do?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandy Escobedo. I'm actually not currently a teacher. I used to be. a pre-kindergarten bilingual teacher in the South Bronx in New York City through Teach for America. So thank you, Teach for America, for giving me the opportunity. I'm just curious, but how does YouTube play into this equation? And please let me know of what my rights are, because I would imagine that YouTube would be the Napster back in the early 2000s to maybe potentially avoiding some of these liabilities in terms of accessing short media clips and hopefully using them to make a connection to either textbooks or whatever lesson you're trying to share with your students.
Is the question, what are your rights with YouTube? Or?
Yes, so in other words, the gentleman mentioned that 15 years ago, a preschool got sued by Disney for utilizing Mickey Mouse on their walls, but I'm wondering, well, am I necessarily going to get sued if I use a clip of The Lion King via YouTube?
My guess would be that, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I play one on TV, but I'm not sure Disney would allow the clip to be on YouTube in the first place, but the things that are allowed on YouTube, I'm not sure if they're not fair game. That's a really good question, and YouTube is not allowed in classrooms because
most school board, at least in New York City, it's not even allowed in classrooms.
But YouTube on the computer, or a teacher selecting from YouTube and playing it?
YouTube can't be streamed on New York City school computers.
Huh. Interesting. And does anyone know the answer to why? Safe. Yeah. Okay. But I could see. But if a teacher found something on YouTube and didn't let the kids have access to it, but I think the question was, could they play it in their classroom? I'm not sure that there's a barrier to that, as long as it's legally on YouTube to begin with. That'll be the bigger issue, correct? Yeah. And other questions along these lines? Yes.
Hi, thanks. My name's Thomas Riddle. Sorry, Harry Potter people. It really is. I'm Tom Riddle. I'm he whose name shall not be named, but it will be named today. And I'm a K-12 social studies coordinator, but education consultant, 20-year public educator, teacher. And first of all, yes, the biggest barrier is, like you're saying, is copyright a lot of times. There's wonderful teachers that are ready to do creative things. And whether the stories are shown in schools or not, bringing in pop culture to teach, the stories are so powerful. You know, great teachers are great storytellers. And no matter what the subject is, even if you're telling it in math, you tell it in a way that you can do that. But for instance, I taught for years Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey to my ancient history and world history classes through using Star Wars, the original trilogy. And I had to explain to parents and administration why I was doing that. And that was because to understand a foreign culture, especially an ancient culture, kids, there's such a disconnect. So I wanted them to understand that every culture we studied their mythology, at least one or two powerful stories. And I would always tell kids, how do you get to know someone? It's through their stories, not what they make for a living or what they do for a living. It's through their stories. And so as that is a framework, I taught them the hero's journey through that. That said, before I taught them the connection with Star Wars with that, I'd say, okay, give me an example of hero partners. And without 20 years ago, it was always Snow White, Disney characters, all Disney characters. Hero's journey, the hero's partners, the dwarves. So that's there, whether you want, whether we can do it or not legally with clips. The thing you were asking earlier about, like, Ms. Carsey, I would love that clip right there. That's a great writing prompt that you can use, just a clip. If we had media, if we had access as teachers to clips of things, we're time pressed. We don't have time to show a lot of full-length features, but there's a lot of good clips that are teachable. And so if anyone can make that happen, and the last point is, there are people that are out there that are good educators that can bridge that gap between the production companies and the classroom teacher. Teachers would like to use it, they just have to be shown how. So if we can find a way to do that today, this week, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
How represented, I know you did the breakdown of the room earlier, Michael, but how many actual teacher education representatives are in the room right now? Okay, good. We weren't sure if we were going to have a lot of representation. Great. Just curious. Other questions? Yes, right there.
Thank you. Joe Wos, I'm from the Toonseum, Pittsburgh's Museum of Cartoon Art. So what a dream panel this is, first of all. Just delighted to see all of you here. My question is, you know, Dawn, I know you work, of course, for Disney, and you work for the great Don Bluth, and all of you have now, either your whole lives or have now gone on to independent production companies. How has that independence allowed for greater creativity and greater freedoms for you?
Wow. Big question. For me personally, I've been able to get into smaller topics and documentaries that I may not have been able to pursue at Disney, where the mandate is for shareholder return on investment and doing things that are franchisable and larger projects. That's all relative though, because I think, for example, one of the worst ideas for a movie of recent years was let's put an 80-year-old man in a house with a Cub Scout and fly them down to South America with balloons. So that was Up, and the other worst idea was let's put rats in a kitchen, which was Ratatouille. So I think there's space for small, quirky, independent movies that can be very, very successful. So I don't see a big difference in my life. I'm still affiliated with Disney and still get my funding in large part from them. And I'm fortunate because they're after good stories. They're after stories that will transport you. Yes, they have to sell. Yes, they have to have a commercial aspect to them. But that won't happen unless the audience really invests in those characters and can, you know, like with the Cosby clip, you can see yourself in those characters and you want to be those characters and you understand it and empathize with them. And that's, to me, what sells movies.
Just on a practical level, when you're independent, whoever controls the purse strings controls a great deal of the creative decision making. So when you're independent, the more independent you can be, the more the creative stuff lies with you. The creative decision making lies with you. And I like that.
One question, two more questions, and then I'll wrap up. Over there in the white shirt.
Hi, Donald Brinkman, Microsoft Research. I'm curious because, you know, in my role, I spend a lot of time, I manage education programs with Microsoft Research. Maybe, there we go. And I spend a lot of time, you know, talking within my company, without my company. You know, when you try to get corporations involved, there's a release from control that has to happen in education, because we can't expect, this isn't an opportunity to get all of education on a single platform or using a single form factor. And I think with content, it's a similar situation, because you have not just the images, but it's also the ideology that comes with the mythologies of these stories that are built up, and there's an interest in preserving those. And when we create tools for kids, there's a term we use, it's called a creepy treehouse. And this is where creepy treehouse. And this is where adults make this place that they want kids to come and play in. And they make it all pretty, and they put candy on the walls and things like that, and they make it all wonderful. And kids have this sort of innate sense that this is kind of a scary place, and they don't want to go there. And I think if we want to really engage with kids, we have to make some concessions to them. And the way I look at it is there's two concessions we have to make that are really important. One is that we have to make this engagement participatory. We have to have the kids be equal partners in creating that content, stories. And that one's not so hard, but I think the second one's really tough for a lot of people. It's tough for technology people, and it's tough for content people. And that's that we have to make this subversive. Kids have an inward rebelliousness where they want to reinterpret reality. And that creativity is ultimately something that we really want to nurture. But if we do something like hand over content to educators so they can do these things, we're not just handing over those images, we're handing over the ability and giving the power to those kids to take those stories and create new stories. And they might take those characters and put them in situations they were never intended to be and pervert those basic things. And I guess to me, that's even fundamentally a more challenging thing to get into. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about how you feel about not just giving over the images and the clips, but allowing those kids to maybe take them places that you might find strange.
Great question. I let my daughter use my 70s jeans as a Halloween costume, so I guess I could let some kids play with these characters. I mean, you know, whatever works for the kid works for the kid, as far as I'm concerned. You know, they're not going to fundamentally change what is, you know, in the archives and what you can buy on DVDs and what you can whatever. You know, I mean, the product well, I'll just speak for myself. The product that we've produced is the product we produced. That is not going to be torn asunder, forever because a kid wants to play. Let the kid play.
I actually have gotten approached by companies where they're creating new technology for kids to make their own animations, and they come to me and say, will you take me to Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon so I can license the characters for the kids to mess around with them, and I almost never agree to do it because I know it's not a deal that's going to ever get done. What I try to encourage is that they maybe co-produce. Like, it would be great if they would create something brand new with the Cartoon Networks and the Nickelodeons of the world, or the Hubs, whoever all is represented here, if they could co-create something. And I think it would be a really interesting project for one of the kids' networks to develop a show that invites kids to mash things up and actually creates a feedback loop back. But that's really different than worrying about what sort of compromising position SpongeBob might end up in. And that's the reality of it. Yeah, it's a great question though. I don't know. Oh, okay. The most active hand gets.
If you wave wildly, maybe you get the microphone. So, I'm Krista Marks. I'm with the Disney Interactive Media Company, and I'm just so delighted to be able to say there has really been a fundamental paradigm shift at Disney. And you can go to Disney.com right now, and you can tell stories with assets. When I started, there was lots of debate about whether we could let these assets be available for kids to tell stories and create art, and the decision was yes. And in fact, we've been launched for 2 years, Disney.com Create, and there's been 7 million stories told with assets, both original content by kids and assets. I was just telling someone, actually, we launched an Avengers comic creator, and there was Marvel, I don't know what Marvel's thinking, but there's a whole series of comics you can go read right now today about who Thor's taking to the prom. So, so it's happening. It's happening already. The assets are available. And not only that, what's most exciting, the biggest thing we won, is you can take it with you. It's not that Disney owns it. You can do a snapshot right there and take it as a JPEG, and it's yours. You can take it, you can print it. So Warren Buttleitner says that that precious childhood moments, there's a finite number of them, and you don't own them. And if you're a media company, you make sure that if a kid creates content, that it's theirs and they can take it with them. And I'm very, very proud that we do that at Disney, and I'm proud to be in a company that I think is really on the forefront of user-generated content. So enough of that. So it's very exciting. My question for the panel is two. One is, you were all kids once. I want to know why did you guys become great storytellers? And then, I don't know, what is your advice for educators to how to help create the next generation of you?
Wow. Doug, I think that's your question.
Well, it sort of asks for a kind of self-congratulatory answer. So let me try and find a. I had, from very early on, I grew up in Los Angeles. I loved movies. I had older friends who took me to see a lot of horror movies, a lot of different kinds of movies. And then I was interested in getting a Super 8 camera, which I got with blue chip stamps. And fairly quickly, as I said before, I got interested in the progression of images. I got interested in stuff like if you did stop motion, with a little car, and then you could have it hit a wall, and you put lighter fluid on it, and it would burn, and you kind of go, wow, I did a car crash, that's so cool. So I do think there's something, pardon? I think there's something innate in that. So I think that, and I certainly know from my 3 daughters, that they, everyone says, tell me a story when I go to bed. I think narrative is something that comes very natural, and I think children have great instincts for storytelling. So, I guess the answer is what kind of stimulating material, by the way, I have to be in this teacher's class, is what kind of ways can that storytelling be stimulated? Can they understand the simple tools? I'm just so amazed. You learn in early editing classes of just the difference of juxtapose. You see a plain face. We all know this thing. You juxtapose something scary before it, and then you read the face a certain way, or you add music. And there's so many of those experiments that kids can do so easily now, get such a sense of that power. So, I think it's just really getting them stimulated by it and making it accessible.
Don, how did you get?
No, I had, thank you, Krista, by the way, for speaking up about that, because I actually believe in the subversive point of view. I had teachers along the way that almost encouraged me to be subversive, and they would give me a framework and say, here's the sandbox you have to deal with and the tools you have to deal with. But they didn't make me conform. And I didn't want to conform, but they didn't make me. And I think that's a lot. I don't consider myself a great storyteller. I consider myself a good recognizer of good storytellers. So I'm able to put together really interesting people and writers and visual artists. And I think when I think about kids in classrooms, I really have a heart for the people in the back of the classroom and the kid that's not a conformist and doesn't have great verbal skills. I think of Tim Burton a lot. I'm making a stop motion film with him right now, and he grew up in the Burbank school system. And he had an art teacher who said it's okay not to draw like everybody else. You don't have to draw like Disney. You don't have to draw like all these other people. And he doesn't, and he had his show's opening at LACMA next week, and it was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it was the third most attended show after Picasso and Matisse. So here's a kid from Burbank who sat in the back of the class with unruly hair and is almost monosyllabic and introverted in his form of communication, but his teacher said, that's okay. You don't have to be like me. You don't have to draw like this. You don't have to read this textbook. You know, yes, you have to finish. Yes, you have to get a grade, but I understand you. And that's a real teacher's-student relationship, and I really believe in that kind of relationship.
Where you came from? The question is about how we came to be. Yes, and what's going to create the future of Marcy Carsey.
Yeah. Well, all kids love to be told stories too, and all kids love to tell stories. Some kids more than others, you know, and I think that's inbuilt. You know, I loved always to act out things and I would make up soap operas.
I did puppet shows. I dressed in drag, anything. That was just last week.
Well, we're running out of time. I can tell because Michael's standing at the podium. First of all, I want to thank all of the panelists. You guys were fantastic. For people who are in the breakouts or actual problem-solving things tomorrow, the notes I took that might be worth some future thought is the notion of teachable clips. Is there some way that we can do that, and whatever the clearances issues, and this might be an industry initiative around, if Hollywood's really interested in doing something about this whole rights issue, it might be something we want to address or introduce the industry to. Maybe there's a whole other Creative Commons for education that has to be created. The power of subversive, both in the Bruno Bettelheim and the question, and I spoke earlier today to the founder of Story Pirates, and he said that their real talent that makes him unique is that his creative director is somebody who seems to know how far you can push sort of the sensibility in a classroom, and it's further than most parents and teachers think, and yet they never go over the line. They've never once been accused of going over the line, so that there's some sort of innate sense that subversiveness to some degree is actually really compelling and probably disarming for the teaching of almost anything with the kids. A big theme also is what are we going to do about making learning more participatory if we're going to actually open up our assets in that way, and how do we do that in a way that both the studios feel comfortable with and that is productive for the kids. And respect for the audience came up at least 6 times. And I think that's true of any presentations, how we feel about you, and also how the great teachers always feel about their students. And so I'm sure that'll filter into the conversations tomorrow. So thanks for your input tonight.
Thank you, Debbie. For those of you who are coming tomorrow, and I hope all of you are, breakfast is, believe it or not, at 7:30. We're beginning in this room at 8:30. These folks have felt your respect and your great affection for their work, and thank you for staying very late. We so appreciate it. Those of you who need to get back to hotels, we are calling a lot of cabs, so check in outside, and we're going to try to make it work. Thanks so much to Betty.